Hey everyone. So, I've talked about actors, actresses, directors, composers, all sorts of the people involved in making a film. So, I should be done with all that, right? Well, there is one person who does have a lot of responsibility that I have not talked about yet. That would be writers. I know writers can be a very subjective thing to talk about with people, but I do think writers deserve credit for their movies, because some of the best movies out there have the writers to thank, because they were so nicely written. And there's a lot to come forward based on who wrote it, whether it's who wrote for the film or even those who wrote the original screenplay that the movie's based off of. And that's what I'm going to do for this list. For this list, I'm going to be talking about my favorite film writers out there, but the catch is different. This list is going to work differently because I'm actually going to be going by all kinds of writers. So, not just the people who write the screenplay for the movie. By writers, I'm going to be including people who maybe were involved with the original screenplay. Like, say I'm talking about a movie based off of a book. The authors of the original book will be included for this countdown. Or even those who made for like a sequel, those who made the original film, and even though they aren't writing the screenplay for this one, they have the materials that this one's based off of. So all kinds of writers will be included for this countdown. I'm going to be listing off my favorite writers and all kinds. People who write the screenplay, people who wrote the original source. And there also will be a couple of directors on this list because there are directors who can also write their movies too. So I'm not going to leave directors out of this. Any writer is available. So just keep that in mind. These are my favorite writers, whether they wrote the screenplay for the film or wrote for what it's based off of. That's what you'll expect from this countdown. Let's do this.
So starting off is a director, naturally. Christopher Nolan. Yeah, we all know who Christopher Nolan is. He's among one of the best directors of our modern Hollywood generation. But along with being a great director, he's also pretty great at writing, because he has written a lot of the movies he directed. And that I think pretty much every movie he directed, he also wrote. He wrote Inception, Dark Knight, Memento, Oppenheimer. He wrote those films along with directing them. There were a couple other people involved, but when it comes to the writing, and especially, of course, the directing, then the man to thank for it is this dude. This man has his priorities straight. He knows how to write a movie. I mean, The Dark Knight's writing, for example, there's lots of dialogue in that movie, and the fact that a movie can have so much dialogue while it's meant to be an action film is quite impressive. Most action movies like to focus a lot of attention on the action scenes because that's what the people are going for. They want action. But with Nolan, he wants to make sure the movie's screenplay actually makes sense. He doesn't want to just focus on writing so that any little detail is a problem. He'll make the script, he'll write it so that it still makes sense overall. There's still an actual story that can be told, and it can feel more realistic and not just one of those cheesy action films that you obviously know is made up. I mean, because as silly as you could find Batman's story to be, The Dark Knight does so well at being realistic towards it. Or even Inception. That movie is a very bizarre idea, but the writing in it is one of the reasons it's able to feel realistic. So yeah, that's what Nolan does. He can direct a movie greatly, but also write a movie pretty amazingly. All right, so this is of course a writer who doesn't who writes the original sources. Good old Stephen King. Everyone knows who Stephen King is. He's among one of the most popular authors of all time. His books are amazing. I don't read as much. I do have a dad who reads a lot of Stephen King, but me, I do know enough about King and the books he wrote. And those books do adapt to films pretty greatly. So, granted, I could thank the people who brought the screenplays to life for that, but the ideas alone are pretty great on their own. So, I think Stephen King deserves that credit. We got stories like Shawshank Redemption, Misery, Stand By Me, The Shining, which is a movie I know he didn't like, but still. There are so many stories he wrote, and these movies capture these stories pretty greatly. Yeah, I know it's weird to say that about The Shining, considering him, but still, no. All the stories that I know, the stories based off of what these movies told, because I don't know how unfaithful it can get. I know The Shining is one of the most unfaithful Stephen King story as far as I'm concerned, but out of all the other ones I have seen, I recognize which ones King praised, and the ones he praised, I know, are the ones that capture the story pretty nicely. So yeah, and they are pretty great stories. They all have a great thing going on. Some of them can follow a similar gimmick, but most of them are fun. Like Misery, for example. The whole idea is well put together. It's a really great thing going for it, and the acting is probably one of the best parts of that movie. But in terms of its story, I think Stephen King deserves that credit. I mean, the writers who brought the film to life are great too, but Stephen King is the one who made these stories to begin with, so we can thank him for giving us these stories at first. The movies definitely are great, and we do need to thank the people who made those movies, but for the stories and who we can thank to have these great stories brought to us, Stephen King's the one to talk to. Look, another director, Stanley Kubrick. We just talked about The Shining and how it's a movie that Stephen King despised, but in terms of what Stanley Kubrick does, I think The Shining is still an amazing film. I don't want to be too rude to King, but come on, it's a great movie. Stanley Kubrick directs a lot of stuff. He's one of the most beloved directors of all time. But again, he's also a pretty great writer. He wrote a lot of his movies to kind of give them that weird thing going for him. But as we all know, the dialogue in most of his films is pretty minimum. Like 2001: A Space Odyssey, for example, there is very little dialogue in that movie, so you could argue that wouldn't necessarily make him that great of a writer. But I think writers do get some credit for the spacing out of what dialogue there is. So his idea of there not being as much dialogue is his idea, and that honestly I find A Space Odyssey to work so well because of that. And yeah, a lot of the other movies that have all this dialogue can go pretty rough ways. You can either have so much dialogue in something like Full Metal Jacket, very little dialogue in A Space Odyssey, or out of nowhere weird dialogue moments in A Clockwork Orange. It's all there. You got this dialogue put together, and I think Kubrick is well recognized for how he handles the way people talk and when they talk. He handles when there should be dialogue and when there should be execution to the scenarios. So yeah, Kubrick's directing is well known, but I think his writing does deserve a little more credit. I feel like people have not really gone too forward with his writing. They've kind of saw him more as a weird director, but as a writer, he definitely does deserve a little bit of credit for what he does there. And yes, John Hughes. The 80s, many people consider to be one of the best times for cinema. Of course, one of the best times for coming of age stories. And I can agree, I was never alive in the 80s, but it seems so fun. I've seen a lot of 80s movies, and John Hughes was the one who brought a lot of the best coming to age stories to life. The 80s brought us The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and all sort of stuff in between. Now, he doesn't only make coming of age stories, most of his direction is towards family comedies and fun comedy ideas, but those are great to watch. I think John Hughes is one of the people that got me introduced to how 80s comedies are. I can thank movies like Airplane or Mel Brooks' stories to give me that sense of how comedy used to be handled. But when it comes to the movies that really got me more into how comedy was back then compared to today, I think John Hughes deserves that thanks. Because a lot of the comedy we see nowadays is quite different than what we got back in the 80s and 90s. And John Hughes is one of the best examples of how we get to see it. He helped me see how great comedy was for these times. Because these movies have a lot of fun going for them. They all have great plots, great characters, hilarious setups, and yeah, they're just so much fun. I mean, you got Home Alone, for example. That's a hugely popular comedy, and John Hughes is one of the best reasons for it. The way most of the film is written is lots of fun. There's fun with this guy. He directs some stuff, but his writing is probably better recognized, I feel like. I feel like his directing is fine, but he doesn't direct as much as he writes much. The stuff he writes is really awesome, so he can direct movies like Breakfast Club or Planes, Church, and Automobiles, but there are times when he's just writing something. You get Home Alone or National Lampoon's Vacation movies. And those are still a ton of fun too. Another director. Yeah, I warned you all about the directors. There are a lot on this list. James Cameron. He directs very interesting sci-fi adventures. And you get some good writing too. I talked about how Christopher Nolan is great at making his even the craziest action movies have a good realistic style of dialogue. Well, I feel like James Cameron can sort of recognize for that too, because his stories are even wackier. The Terminator, for example, that's a seriously wacky story, but every every line of dialogue in that movie, as far as I know, is near flawless. Okay, I've only seen the first two Terminator movies, but they are the best ones, and that dialogue in those movies is pretty good. I honestly don't think I can really talk about a single flaw of how each scene dialogue is handled. So honestly, I think he really does write those movies greatly. Or even some of his more over the top films like Avatar or Titanic, ones that make so much money, and people mostly talk about the problems with them since they're so popular now. Well, you know what? I really think I can still defend these movies. Avatar is not one of the best movies in the universe, but it is still a very nice one. And yeah, we argue that the story has been done millions of times, but there is a good sense of at least some new dialogue involved with it. And I can definitely appreciate how such an idea that we've seen before can still work with new lines and new little scenarios for it. So, Cameron, he's great at directing mostly of the time, but his writing, I feel, it comes a little underappreciated. He really can write something that is over the top and insane, but those who have gotten used to it can at least understand what the lines are. So, it's made for the movies are made for those who are addicted to the sci-fi moments, but when they rewatch it and are ready to actually understand the film, they can hear the dialogue and how it works, and that's just one thing Cameron can do great with. All right, now let's get into the animated world of writing. Pete Docter, he works for Pixar, as you can tell, and Pixar is freaking amazing. I know, I talk a lot about how much I love Pixar, but I'm sorry, I can't stop myself. It's so damn good. Pete Docter has written a lot of Pixar movies, and by a lot, I mean these are actually the only films he's written for Pixar. But hey, there's some pretty great ones. He wrote Wall-E, Toy Story, Up, Inside Out, Monsters Inc., Toy Story 2. They're all amazing films. So even if it's not as big a variety of stuff he's written, they're amazing movies. Okay, the writing in those movies are really great. There's comedy, there's drama, there's all sorts of that stuff that you can hear with each character. So the writing in all these movies are just really nice. Even Toy Story. We always talk about little flaws in writing, but I still think it works really well to this day in terms of writing. We always butch about how great the movie is in terms of being revolutionary with its animation, but you know what? It's also really amazing with its comedy and well put together structure of a story that's obviously made for kids, but when you get older, you aren't going to get too bothered by it. And that's the beauty of some great animated movies. The movies that are made for kids, but do still work in a very similar way when you get older. If I'm able to watch an anime movie that I can love as a kid, but still really enjoy the same way as a grown up, and that's a damn good animated film. And Pete Docter is definitely to thank for that. So it's to wonder, is Pete Docter the king of Pixar writers? Maybe this is it. Maybe I can consider Pete Docter the best writer in all of Pixar. All right, now let's get into something that's a little cheating. Bob Kane. He's the creator of Batman. Yeah, I know. There are tons of Batman movies out there. There's tons of stories, and all of them do follow a different pace or whatever. But the overall idea of who Batman is and his story is a pretty creative one. And when it comes to how Batman's story is in general, that's who Bob Kane can be thanked for. There are lots of silly gimmicks the movies can throw at us, but in terms of who the character is and who all the characters alone are, they really have this guy to thank for him. Batman being a boy who lost his parents and seeks every day for vengeance, disguising himself, hiding in the shadows. Bob Kane came up with that, and it became such a beloved character that honestly, he is one of the reasons a lot of his movies shine because it's such a damn good character to follow. Or even the villains he has. The Joker, for example, he's awesome. And there's the Riddler, pretty cool too. Catwoman, Penguin, all in between. And I know not every Batman movie is great. I mean, there's the Batman and Robin or the Batman versus Superman in between all that. But the ones that are good do have Batman's story arc as well as some of the other characters that come from the original comic to thank. I think that's what makes The Dark Knight so great, in my opinion. How great it is with its action, but how well its characters are handled. And yeah, again, Christopher Nolan can be thanked for how the story's put together, but for where the characters come from, seeing them adapt to this world. I think Bob Kane deserves credit for that because his character has such a good name to him, and his story really can work in so many ways. So for having one simple character have a story that works so well for many different stories is definitely something to be proud of. So Obviously, we don't have a Bob Kane nowadays, but his work really did create a generation for superheroes. And yeah, look at this. It turns out Pete Docter is not the ultimate writer for Pixar. That award would have to go to Andrew Stanton. Andrew Stanton not only wrote more Pixar stories, but his writing just seems to have a much nicer impact towards it. He did write a very some of the same movies that Pete Docter wrote, like Wall-E or Toy Story. Yeah, Pete Docter and Andrew Stanton both wrote them. But, along with that, there's also a lot of other stories he wrote that Pete Docter didn't really have much help with, like Toy Story 3, Finding Nemo. He was the one who was able to make those stories very emotional. So I think he can be the one to talk about when it comes to the emotions. I think Pete Docter's work could come from how humorous a movie can get with its drama, while Andrew Stanton can work with how dramatic a movie can get while working with its humor. That might be a good way to look at it. You got someone who loves comedy but's able to work with drama, and someone who loves drama but is able to work with comedy. Andrew Stanton is definitely the great example for that. He's probably one of the reasons that these Pixar movies shine so well. He's probably the reason that my love for animation came to be, because Pixar will always be the one animation studio that I always love. DreamWorks, Studio Ghibli, whatever, I'm sorry. I'm always a Pixar guy. Pixar is the studio that got me into animation, and I know there are lots of things that we love to praise animation for, but to me, Pixar can accomplish so much that I don't know if I ever want to go against it. Look, another time where I feel like I'm cheating a little bit. Stanley is the creator of almost all Marvel creations. Actually, not really almost. Every Marvel superhero in existence that we got in the MCU or any other Marvel story, Stan Lee is in charge from. And yeah, I know he just wrote the characters and all, but like I said with Bob Kane, writing the characters is one way to make such a great movie. A lot of these movies do fall a little bit from their source material. Like, there are lots of moments in these movies that do take sort of a new approach, but for the most part, they're based off of comic books. And a lot of the same moments from these movies do come from the original comics that Stanley wrote. So yeah, he can definitely be appreciated for these stories and how well they work with the stuff that they have for the big screen. Even Stanley himself can approve that. And, we all know that he's great at making cameos in all of his films, or at least he could until his sad death in 2018. But still, him being able to cameo in a lot of the movies that he was the inspiration for just goes to show how much we appreciate his work and how much he appreciates seeing his stuff be adapted. And I think that can still be appreciated as a writer. Someone who writes these stories and then they get adapted to something that works. Because, again, maybe not all Marvel movies work, but the ones that do have the characters and little structures for the story to be thanked by this guy. If you don't get what I'm saying, I'm sorry, that's just what I'm going by, because Stanley is a very talented writer. And I have read some of the comics that he made, so I guess I can say that. And yeah, number one is the guy who created Star Wars. What big surprise, Star Wars is so well written. Yeah, you get the drift. Star Wars, in my opinion, is still the best written story ever. Every Star Wars movie, yes, even the ones that we criticize, have a really nice thing going for them. The structure, the idea of a galaxy far, far away is just amazing to think about. It's such a creative idea. And the way that George Lucas was able to make such a weird thing work as such a great, massive idea with such new things and an entirely different world of characters, it's impressive for me. I know we could argue that there are a lot of movies in the past that Star Wars took inspiration from, but all of those mashed together for one story that's still pretty impressive to think about. We're always used to stories that would take place in our world and what weird things we could see. But with Star Wars, it's a multiple galaxies, multiple different locations, different kind of characters. It's nonsense, but it's the kind of nonsense I love. You know, and of course, Star Wars is not the only thing he's written. He's also written Indiana Jones, which I guess is pretty amazing too. But I'm mostly calling him number one for Star Wars. I mean, come on. I know you could argue he didn't write the newer Star Wars movies, but he did was. But again, he wrote the characters and most of the stuff that we would see in these new Star Wars movies. So there's the new stuff that's brought into these movies, but then there's all the stuff that George Lucas provided. And so, yeah, you can be the one to thank for what he provides to keep this Star Wars franchise going strong. Yeah, again, we can argue there are the bad things, but with every bad thing, there's always got to be a great one. And I feel like I still have hope that Star Wars can still go strong and still provide great new media. It's proven itself to still do well. We can still get great Star Wars. But, who knows? Still, this guy's the guy to thank for it because for what we got in the beginning, we got such an amazing story. And I know many people wouldn't call it their top tier, but me, I'll always be a huge Star Wars fan. You can't stop me. Star Wars is my life. Okay, it's not, but I love Star Wars still. I still think it's my favorite movie ever, my favorite franchise ever, all that. So, George Lucas, you're not watching this, but if you were, just know that you have all my respect.